Welcome back to the Good Girl Confessional. I'm your host, Sandy Lowres, and the Good Girl Confessional is proudly brought to us by WB40, Women Beyond 40, a platform for women 40, 50, 60 and beyond. And you can check us out at wb40.com. Before we begin today's podcast, I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and those that are emerging. Today in the podcast, I am very, very excited to be talking to a powerhouse chick in her 60s. She's amazing, Bron Williams. Bron has had this extraordinary life. She's done a lot of things, everything from being an ordained minister to working with asylum seekers on Nauru. She is quite an extraordinary person, and her life's purpose now is helping women reconnecting to their power and finding their purpose. She is lovely. She's so generous with her time and her spirit. Talking to Bron, you will definitely feel seen and heard. She's incredible. Please welcome to the confessional, Bron Williams.
Hey, it's another Sandy here, Sandy Davies. I'm the founder and formulator of Happy Pause Balm for intimate dryness. Find us over at happypause.com.au. That's happypause.com.au, and get some happy on down there. And in the meantime, keep listening to Powerhouse Sandy Lowres on the Good Girl Confessional podcast, where every woman has a story.
Hi, Bron. Welcome to the Good Girl Confessional. How are you?
I was going to say I'm really well, but I'm struggling a little bit with a head cold. But apart from that, I'm fine. I am in good spirits.
Oh, good. Bloody Melbourne weather. That's all we can say. Bron and I are both Melbourne girls.
Yes. My partner brought it home last week, and I thought I was going to resist it, but no, it hit like a ton of bricks on Monday. So yes, I'm glad I'm doing this today.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm so thrilled. Thank you so much for joining me today, because I am so intrigued by everything that you do, Bron, and we've had several conversations. I think what I love about you, you're such a powerhouse woman, and you've been through a lot. I think one of the terms that you used is you've had a lot of past lives, past whatever in this one life. I'm really fascinated by that, because I think for most of us as women of this age, in this age demographic, is that we have worn a lot of hats, we've done a lot of things, and it's very easy to lose ourselves in that. But I'm so fascinated by the kind of life journey that you have had that just brought you to this place where you want to just lift other women up and help other women to reconnect to their power. So maybe let's go back a little bit and tell us the Bron story, because it's important, and I really want to hear about it.
Yeah, thank you, Sandy. So, use the typical joke. I was born at a very early age, but I was born the year that television came to Australia, and the year of the Melbourne Olympics. So certainly been here for a few decades, and the grey hair certainly gives that away. My family was, I was born 5 years after my parents got married, and they'd just about given up hope of having a child of their own, and they were considering adoption. We've later learnt that my father, having contracted malaria in the Admiralty Islands during the Second World War, malaria has an impact on male fertility, but it will wane, and it literally just needed time to get out of Dad's system, because then, of course, my brother arrived 2 years later and my sister 2 years later. So there was nothing wrong with their fertility. It just needed time. And as my mum used to joke, which I thought was funny for someone who was raised in a very, very strict household, she said, once we learned where to put things, we were okay. So, she used to make funny little jokes about that. So, anyway, but I think because I was this much...
Yeah, I love that.
I think because I was this much longed for child, that actually came with some unconscious weighted of responsibility on me that I don't think my parents intended, but it was just part of the package, I think, where I think obviously all their hopes and dreams were pinned in me to start with, and I, was the like all eldest children, you're the guinea pig for a parent. Never done it this way before. But what I've realised since was that because I was the eldest, I took on a lot of those expectations for myself. And so I became what I call the QGG, the quintessential good girl. And that's when you said your podcast was called the Good Girl Confessional. I thought, right, this is right up my alley. So, yeah. So I went on from being so I was the QGG, the quintessential good girl. I was the good daughter. I went on to become the good wife and the good mother. And then you layer that over with my conservative Christian upbringing. So I was the good Christian girl, the good Christian daughter, the good Christian wife, and the good Christian mother. And they were roles that I actually thought that was what I needed to be, what I should be. And I think that's part of my personality. I wanted to be, I was going to say I wanted to be liked, but it came out of being, my parents, neither of them were affectionate people. And I think that's partly a generational thing. They were both born in the 1920s. Neither of them said, I love you. I'm not even sure that I've ever heard my father say, I love you. Even though you sensed there was love, it wasn't as though it was a loveless home, but I'm a words person and I wanted those words. But because I didn't hear them, I was getting these messages that somehow I needed to be good, I needed to be better, I needed to do really well. And if I did that, then maybe they'd tell me that they loved me. Maybe they'd tell me that they were proud of me. So I think that had been my driving force for probably 6 decades, which is crazy. But, that's what happens with our early conditioning.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, look, that is very true. And I think especially for women, as I was saying before, obviously.
And so then
of a certain generation where it was very difficult for our parents to talk about their emotions, I think.
Yes, I agree. I know that when my father passed away, and he's been gone for, 17 years now, and Mum's been gone for about 3 or 4, Mum didn't cry. And she'd tell herself she was silly if she said, in her words, she got a bit teary. No, and I would think, you've been married to this man for over 50 years. He dies, you're allowed to be sad. But her body responded by, she got itchy skin. No amount of creams or going to the doctor could fix it. And I just think that was her way that her body was exhibiting her grief.
Hey there! When Sandy's not interviewing kick-ass women, she's hanging out with me at Alex the Seal, a podcast about music and nostalgia. I'm Jo Pybus, and each episode, Sandy and I talk about all the songs that got us hooked up, knocked up, and broken up. Do yourself a favour and search Alex the Seal on your podcast app. Love you, Molly!
That's really, so you were saying that your mum's body responded because she didn't cry outwardly, or she wasn't able to show that emotion outwardly. And so what happened with Mum?
Yeah, so in the end, I think she worked through her grieving because after a while that itching went away. But, I know that my own perfectionism, setting the bar higher, never being a high needs achiever, all of that came out of, in a sense, the conditioning that I received as a child, that love, affection, worth, value were all linked to achievement. And, look, I was a bright kid. I'm doing a PhD. I was always bright, but I never felt as though I did enough to maybe be the daughter that I thought they wanted. I don't know. I never asked those questions, but it's always that onward, always striving for better, which now I don't do, but it's taken quite a while to get here.
Yeah, I think that's a common theme amongst women generally. I think is, it starts at a very young age because we're so damn conditioned to believe that whatever we do, we're not enough. Society tells us that.
Yes.
Unconscious bias and conscious bias that we know it. It's innate, right? Of course, it's not true, but the reality is this is how we're programmed to believe, that regardless of what we achieve, what we put out into the world, somehow we always feel we're that little bit lacking.
Yeah, and I wonder whether it isn't that whole, and I'll use the term patriarchy loosely, but the world, I can't think of a culture or society that is not innately patriarchal. Mm-hmm. So, it doesn't matter what your culture is or your background or your generation. That's what both men and women are born into. But if patriarchy is the norm, if the male is the standard, then women are never going to be enough because, hello, we're different. And I think part of it is that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree. And I think that you're right. We definitely live in these sort of patriarchal societies, because when you look at more Indigenous culture, it's very different. The way that women are viewed is so different. That women in a lot of cultures are seen to be this incredible matriarchal, almost like revered creatures within their communities, and in some cultures, as women age, even more so, they become like the bearers of the wisdom, right? And in sort of more white Western culture, that just doesn't seem to exist.
Yeah, and I think it's also, but it's not just white Western culture. If you look at a lot of African cultures, very patriarchal there. The whole one man and a number of different wives. I do know of people who have been born into that situation. A lot of Asian cultures are still very patriarchal, like the subcontinent in India. So that's why I say I think it's actually a human issue rather than just a Western cultural issue. Yet I do agree that in the more like uniquely Indigenous cultures, the women are honoured for their difference. I've been following a Lakota man on Twitter, and I've been learning a lot about the Lakota culture through his posts, and the whole thing around transgender and two-spirit people. You used to go, oh, that's just normal from their perspective.
Which is so beautiful, isn't it? It is this kind of a very beautiful honouring of people just as they are.
Just as they are, but of women as being strong and powerful. And you do see it in Indigenous cultures in Australia. Like I do know that, domestic violence is an issue in Indigenous communities, but how much of that is what we as white people have introduced in terms of how we behave? I don't know, because we can't go back to a pure Indigenous culture here in Australia. because
Very
it's all
true, but I
different.
will also say too, there's an alarming rise of domestic violence in all aspects, sadly, of Australian communities.
Yes.
And I know this because I do actually, my other life is working in a women's legal service.
Mm,
Sadly, those are shocking. There are shocking stats around that at the moment, but the reality is that, yeah, child protection, violence, especially domestic violence, but especially against women. That's not to say it never happens against men, but the overwhelming majority of cases are, unfortunately, the women as victims. And yeah, so this seems to be a global phenomenon, though. This is not just happening in Australia, but you're right. It is. It's definitely on the rise, and it's quite terrifying, really.
it is, and you only have to think of those high-profile cases of that lovely family in Queensland who the husband just
Yeah,
firebombed the car. Like
yeah,
I don't get that. That just does not compute with my brain system. How you would be so needing control that you would kill your own children. I get being really angry with a
yeah.
spouse or an ex-spouse, but to just say, no, my children are not worth living, I will kill them. That makes absolutely no sense to me. But then again, we have to
No,
remember
it doesn't, and it's
that,
such a layered, incredible. Like, it's a very layered and very complex issue, which sadly we're not going to be able to solve here on the Good Girl Confessional. But you're right. Yeah, it's mind-boggling. It's very difficult to comprehend the layers of what goes on in these situations. Really,
Mm,
horrendous. And there's some really amazing people out there lobbying and doing great work, trying to figure out these things, and to find out why it's so prevalent, and how to fix it, right? How to support women, early intervention. There's a whole lot of programs that people are trying to put in place, but it's a very large, very complex kind of issue, as we
yeah.
said, and not just in Australia, everywhere globally right now. So yeah, it's interesting.
Mm,
This kind of takes me to something, though, because we were just touching on different cultures. So, Bron, throughout your life, you've had an opportunity to work with asylum seekers. And I
yes.
wanted to talk with you a little bit about that because you have a background in education as well. You're a school principal and you've worked with people, asylum seekers. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, that was midlife. So, had got married, did the normal good girl things. I got married, I had three sons. The marriage was not happy. And it took me a lot of years actually after I left the marriage to recognize that I had been the victim of domestic abuse, but emotional abuse, more on the neglect side, and sort of humiliation and things like that. I call it death by 1,000 cuts. So I left the marriage.
Mm,
I turned 50. Um, in in the biblical narratives, the Jubilee year was every 50 years, and that's when you'd let the land lie fallow, and families who'd become enslaved would be set free, all of those sorts of things. And so I always saw that my 50th year was my Jubilee year, and I finally left the marriage after 28 years, not really knowing why I left, because there was no shouting, there was no physical abuse, but just I couldn't make it work. And I tried. Dragged him along to counselling and all of those sorts of things. But of course, he couldn't see what the issue was, and because it was so covert, I couldn't actually identify either. Just knew, couldn't stay any longer. And after that, I joined the Salvation Army. Had this, strong Christian background, and it was the only church in the town that I felt I could go to after I'd left my husband and didn't want to sort of turn up at church with him on this, every Sunday, and went on to train with them as a Salvation Army officer and became an ordained minister and did my degree, my honours degree in theology. And it was during that time that the Australian federal government reopened the offshore processes on Nauru and opened one on Manus Island, and the Salvation Army had the welfare contract on both of those places. And an email went around asking, the volunteers and workers and officers if they would go to Nauru or Manus for 4 weeks. And I put my hand up, not because I had a burning desire to work with refugees or to work in the tropics, but because I couldn't think of a reason why not to. So it was one of those serendipitous decisions that you make that end up being life-changing. So I landed on this tiny little tropical island, 35 kilometres south of the equator. And the first 4 weeks there was, life-changing in so many ways. I was for the first time totally out of my comfort zone. Like, I'd done a lot, I'm in my mid-50s by this stage, faced quite a few different things, but I had never been to a country where everybody had a different skin colour to me. So Nauru, they're Pacific Islanders. And then I was working with asylum seekers who were all different shades of brown and black. They were from Afghanistan and Iran and Iraq, Pakistan, some from different countries in Africa. And it was literally on the first day that I first started to feel this in myself. My stomach's churning. I'm thinking, and it wasn't just that, I'm a bit nervous sort of thing. It was a real churn. And I knew I was physically safe. There were guards everywhere, and these men, they were in trauma. So, they weren't going to do anything to me. It took me a while to figure out that my body was actually telling me something that my head hadn't caught up with yet, and that was that I was afraid. Then I had to think about, well, why am I afraid? These men are being respectful to me. I'm safe. And that's when I started to think about, well, what have I done before this that's anything like what I'm doing now? And the answer was nothing. And I had nothing to compare this experience with. And that's when I started to realise, hello, I've lived most of my life in talking to people who look like me, sound like me, think like me, have maybe a faith background that's similar to mine. And like most of these men came from Muslim countries. And that's, just because I'm naturally reflective, try and say that fast, naturally reflective, I started to look back and, sort of connect the dots. And I thought, I remembered sort of times when, mum or dad would make a comment about people who were different. And, everybody had to be like us, or we had to be like everybody else. That sense of normalcy about, people who were like us and people who were different was something, they just weren't right. And I realised that this sense of fearing difference fed into a latent racism just from growing up in purely white Australia. Not intentional. I wouldn't have said I had a racist bone in my body, but I realised that I did. And as I confronted that, and as I started to observe how the white expats were dealing with the Nauruan people, I saw this sense of superiority, came across the idea of white privilege for the first time. So those two things were huge wake-up calls for me to help me see myself in a different light. Because when I talked with one of the women who headed up the Nauruan team for the Salvation Army about what I was observing about the white expats' behaviour, their sense of superiority, she said, "We know that about you guys, but we just accept it." And I thought, my goodness.
And there it is. Yep.
And there it is. It was like saying,
wow. And
okay, it's real.
And there it is. Yeah. Bron, this is one of many things that I love about you, but one of the things I really love about you is this ability to be so honest about where you are and your journey and the things that you've learned yourself and your ability to reflect inward, because I do think there's a lot of people, white people, who they can't seem to face this thing about themselves, right? And I do think if we have, in order for things to change and for racism to be stamped out, the reality is, first of all, you have to identify and accept the parts of your own self where that is, where it's innate, where it's learnt, where it's unconscious, where it's whatever it is. We all have to face it, right?
Yep.
Because through that, that's really the only genuine way that we can be good allies as well to our friends who are people of colour. Because if you can't face it in yourself and you can't reflect inward about these things, then how do you then go forth in the world and support others, right? But it's not enough to go, oh, I don't see colour. That's a ridiculous statement. And then we take away the beautiful identity of people by saying this sort of rubbish. And it's like, a friend of mine is Carly Finlay. She's a disability advocate. She says the same thing about disability. When people go, oh, I don't see it. And you go, of course you see it. Like,
I
why
was
are you
going to say,
taking away my
particularly with
identity?
someone
And
like
I think that's
Carly, who has a skin condition.
right. It's powerful.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, and she's a facial difference advocate. So the same applies, and also too that she is also a person of color. Like her mum is from South Africa. I mean, this is a reality, and so I think it's a fascinating thing. But I love that you didn't get there, feel these feelings, and then run away. What happened was you obviously, and what a beautiful story, and thank you so much for sharing it. Because it's a powerful story, that you sat in it and reflected and kind of really forced yourself to confront these feelings. Why do I feel like this? Why am I, and it's a tough gig, right, to kind of confront things about ourselves we don't really want to know or we don't want to face.
Look, it is. But you know what started me on doing that journey? It was a number of years before this, when I was part of still in the Salvation Army. We'd gone for a leadership day with women, and the psychologist who was running a particular session put a number of cards on the floor, as you do, those cards that they have with quotes on. And I picked up a quote by, guess who, Brené Brown, that says,
Oh, I love Brené.
and the quote was, and it's maybe my version of the quote, but along the lines of, the most courageous thing that we can do is to own our story and love ourselves through the process.
Yeah.
For me, that was important around my divorce story. But once I'd figured out how to do that for myself, that if I own, divorce was not part of my life's journey, not on my plan at all, but it happened and I felt shame over it. Now, it is not shameful to get divorced, but I felt shame because of particularly my Christian background. Brené's words helped me to say, just own the story. It's your story. And that's when I felt all that shame and guilt drop away. So once having owned that story, when I saw other stories in my life that I didn't particularly like being racist and having white privilege, it's much easier then to own them, because when we own something, we look at it, say, this is mine. No one can poke fingers at me. I'm owning this story. No one can judge me. I'm owning this story. There's no shame, and therefore I can talk about it without any shame or guilt.
Which is so fabulous. And it's like people have said to me, I've written about my story, owning my story as a kid. I was sexually abused and, all sorts of things. And because I've written about it, I actually recently, my story is part of an anthology, which I'm very proud of, called The Power to Rise Above, 30 women owning their stories.
I have just finished reading that book.
Yay, thank you. Thank you. Super incredibly proud to be a part of that book, and to be in very safe hands with the editor, Sandy Davies. I always like to shout out to Sandy because it's incredible kind of a job to do that, to bring women together like that. But it was like when people said to me, oh God, you're so brave. How could you tell that story? And I said, well, because I lived it. It's true. It's my story. And I'm at peace, I'm okay with it. It's not something, one doesn't just get over it. You don't get over it. It will always be a part of who I am. And it's a driving force for things that I have gone on to do, right? So I think, it's a part of why I became who I am. And that's the thing that I accept about it. And, you know, but you're right. Once there is a facing and an acceptance of something and you own something, and I love that about Brené Brown too, because it's very powerful. Once you own your story, you're right. You can go on to do like incredible things, but more important, you're able to talk about it. And the powerful thing about us telling our stories, like your story that you just told then, other people will resonate with that, and it will help other people to go, oh, damn it, that's how I feel too, and now I've got to do the work. Or they might just say, yep, I've been through a similar journey and I'm out the other side. And storytelling is so powerful for that reason. It helps others, I think, to be able to share their stories, whether publicly or privately, with those around them. And I think there's something innately incredible about the ability to do that.
I completely agree. But there's a sense in which, too, stories are not just for story's sake. It's not just about me telling a story and you going, oh, that's a wonderful story, Bron. Because my story, like as you said, my story allows other people to resonate and go, oh, okay, I get where she's at, or she understands what I'm talking about. But I also need to be able to, I believe anyway, that I need to be able to move from the story to the purpose, to the lesson, to the message, to the next step. I think there's a time and place for getting stuck in the story, because I think that's actually part of the journey for us. You know, you've got to sit with your story long enough where you're comfortable with it and telling your story when you and I've done that. I've done that on film, you know, as well as in a book where I'm in tears as I've told my story, and that was okay for the moment. I wasn't where I am now. So it's important to be able to be stuck in the story, but you can't stay there either. And I think, to be able to take your story and, you know, like you've said, you've used some of your story for your life's purpose. I'm certainly using my story for my purpose now in my third act, which is I'm working with women, because it adds depth. It adds, our stories give us insight and wisdom that we don't get any other way.
Yeah, very true. And one of the things I always say in this podcast about the guests, yourself included, is it's hard-won wisdom, Bron, because no one hands us our wisdom on a silver platter. Sadly, we have to sometimes walk through the fire and the ashes to gain that wisdom. And as you say, it's the wisdom that creates a purpose almost. And as you say, if you can, I agree. I agree with you. Like, I think there is a time to be stuck in the story when it's the whole story.
Yeah.
And then there's a time when that story becomes just one chapter in your life. And then there's a whole lot of other chapters that follow, which is really important and great and valuable point. And I've said that to others before as well. I agree wholeheartedly. So let's get to that, because all of these incredible things in your life, these experiences, this wisdom that you now carry, you're using this, as you said, you call it the third act, but it is your passion for really helping women to reconnect with their inner power. So tell me about that.
And it's interesting, this has only crystallized for me in the last 12 months. I've been working towards this, doing a variety of different things, running, you know, coaching and all of these things along the way. And I think that's really important to know too, is that yes, there will come a time when you land on perhaps your one thing, but it takes a series of steps to get there. And each of those steps is important because they give you wisdom and understanding. Last year for me is what I call my chrysalis year. Now, I hardly had any work, thank goodness for my superannuation. That was despite, didn't matter how many emails, people I approached, there was no incoming work. And yet I was active on social media, blog posts, going to events, all of these things. But what was happening behind all of that activity was that I had entered that year as the little caterpillar. I emerged as the butterfly, but in between I had to do the chrysalis, which is a dissolving. And that is significant work in and of itself. Now, I didn't know that was happening, and that's the interesting thing. I didn't know that was happening until I turned into the butterfly. And then I could look back and go, oh, I see what's been going on now. And there was a really good reason why I wasn't getting a lot of work, is because I wouldn't have had the sort of the bandwidth to do the chrysalis work and be putting out in a workplace situation. So, at the time you just think, what am I doing wrong? Why isn't this working? All of those stupid questions we ask ourselves, because 9 times out of 10 it's got nothing to do with us. But it was all about me actually starting to see all of the things that you've just said, of just being able to take all the wisdom of the last, I'm 67 years or 66 years at that stage, and going, oh, I see where it all fits now. And that's where this whole idea of working with women, which again has been an iteration, like the reality is over the last 7 years that I've had my business, my only clients have been women. Funny about that. Didn't set out that way, but they've only been the people that who have been drawn to me. And it's always been about, and when I look back again, always been about women who are on a cusp, who are ready to make some changes and and are just needing some guidance. So I have been doing that work for 7 years. I just haven't named it. I hadn't identified what it was that I'm doing, and now I have. Because what I've observed is that so many of us as women, we give our power away. We're taught to give our power away, that our needs are not the same value as those of other people. And so we give our power away, but we get to a point where we go, enough is enough. And they're the women I'm working with, women who I call are on the cusp, who are going, I want to do more in my career. I want to do more I want to start a new business. I want to make changes in my personal life. And so, we work together and I help people explore themselves, because that's been my greatest strength for me, is exploring me. And as you get to know yourself better, you're actually able to do more about the things that need to change in the external environment.
Yeah, I love that. I love it so much, because this is really, for me, that's what it's all about. And I think the really fascinating thing for me is, I've always been quite a curious person. So I've chopped and changed hobbies and things and whatever in my life, because I'm always like, I go, oh, that's caught my attention. I really want to try that. Some people call it bravery. Some people call it sheer stupidity. I don't really know, Bron. What I know is that, I feel like I've only got one life, and give it a go. Why not? And one of the things was, of course, the podcast. And so I had this podcast was a blog, and it was a blog for nearly 7 years. And she grew up and evolved into a podcast, because I said one day, oh, I wanted to start a podcast. And I had friends at that time saying, what the hell's a podcast? What is that? And I was like, but I had a very clear vision. I wanted to speak to women, and I really wanted to speak to women who are 40, 50, 60, 70, 80. I wanted to talk to these women, because I feel like my impression is every time I meet women in this age bracket, that they are wise and that they've gone through life experience and they've got these incredible stories to tell, and no one's listening. And I'm like, how is this even possible? But I think what's happened through doing this work, and I wonder if you feel the same way, through doing this work and speaking to so many extraordinary women, yourself included, is that I continue to grow as a human being as well, through their lessons and through their bravery and their resilience, and through them sharing their stories and trusting me with that I've continued to grow. And I feel like since I've started this podcast and the magazine platform, I've grown so much.
Yeah, I don't think that we can do anything but grow if we're remaining open to, whether you call it God, the universe, karma, You know, if you're just remaining open to what comes your way and learning from things. And I have often said, you know, life is going to deal you crappy things. Make sure you learn something out of it. You know, don't just let it be a crappy thing in your life, because there is a lesson to be learned in it. And that's not to diminish the difficult things in life to a lesson. That's not at all. But I figure if you're going to go through a really difficult time, draw out the gold, because there are things that you can only learn down there in the mud. You can't learn it up in the sunshine, unfortunately. So, you know, make the most make the most of the crap, you know. But I agree, but it's a choice though. I really do believe it's a choice, Sandy, because not everybody chooses to really learn lessons from life. You know, I've met women and men in their 60s and 70s who are still behaving as teenagers, with the whole, you know, it's my way or the highway, and the world owes me a living. You know, so I do believe it's a choice as well.
Yeah, I've met a lot of people too who have just been they appear to be stuck. You know, when I say stuck, it's like they've gone through a life experience. Let's just pluck it out. Let's say divorce, and then they get stuck there, and it's like they can't see a life beyond that, and so they always are still, you know, in this grief, even though it might have happened 20 years ago. And
Yes.
so I have met a number of women who are really stuck like that. And I wonder if it's because they just can't figure out their purpose. Like I feel like all human beings need purpose. Once we have purpose, nothing can hold you back.
Yeah, I agree. Purpose is incredibly important, and I've always been a person of purpose who wants to make an impact. So that's been my my goal always. But yeah, and I don't know why. I'll have to be honest. I have no idea why I'm made that way, because I know not everybody in my family thinks along the way, same way as I do either. So maybe it's just how I'm wired.
Yeah, nice. But I love that now you're trying to help other women, because you get all of that in your life, that you are now saying you can change. You can change your purpose. You can find your purpose. You can pivot. You can do a number of things, right? Women, I think this is such a glorious stage of life, sometimes a difficult stage of life. But, your children are growing up. A lot of us have been the sandwich generation. Our parents are either very, the elderly and we're looking after them, or a lot like myself, where your parents have passed away. And you then suddenly start to have this time to think about and dwell on, well, who am I? And what do I want out of my life, right?
Mm. Yeah, and like you, I work with women 45 plus, because I think it wasn't until I was sort of in my early to mid 40s that I actually even had headspace for thinking about anything more than mothering and all of those things. But I would like to see, because I've thought a bit about, I'd love to be able to talk with young women too about the process that I take. Yeah, love to be able to talk with young women about the process that I take women through to rediscover their power, so that they don't have to get to the rediscover bit, that they can tap into it and know that it's valuable to tap into right from the word go. That would be my ideal. I was, as you do, lying in bed just before you go to sleep and your brain goes off in different directions. And I'm thinking, oh, that would be amazing. So who knows? Maybe I'll end up there as well, because there's a sense in which the work I do is remedial, because I've had to remediate myself. Wouldn't it be wonderful to do preventative work?
Yes, and there are a lot of young women out there who are doing incredible stuff, and you see that they are owning their power, and it's so brilliant. But there's also a lot of younger girls and women who feel a little bit lost in the big world. And I think how beautiful if you can get to that early intervention, if you like, to go, hey, you are powerful, and let's help you tap into that. Imagine how their
Yes.
lives will turn out.
Well, that's right. I read a wonderful meme the other day about, I think they were talking about millennials, that for millennial women, they've been raised to believe that they can be empowered, strong women, and yet there's still a lot of cultural norm about them being the main caregivers of children. And so they really are trying to do it all. So I think we need to even shift it even further, that women can be powerful and do all the things that they need to do. We're probably never going to get to the point where, there'll be anybody else other than biological women who can bear children. But we need to work more in the caregiving space. And I know there are a lot of men advocating for more support for men to be active fathers, so that we can get to a much more balanced place where both men and women can be pursuing their dreams as individuals and having a family that they love and care for.
Yeah, I think that is a huge thing, by the way. And there's many ways that patriarchal societies, I guess, control women. One of them is definitely childcare.
Yes.
Absolutely. But I'm heartened by the fact that, there are some organizations now paying, 18 weeks of paid parental leave, not just
Yes.
maternity leave, but parental leave. So dads can have that opportunity as well. And, I'm of a generation, I'm 53. Certainly there was no paid maternity leave at all when I had my 3 kids, like none. And there was certainly no government support with childcare. Like there just wasn't. And, I've always worked, I'm a woman who has always worked full time, even with the kids. And so I feel like, childcare used to be ridiculous. And I used to meet a lot of women who would say, oh, I envy you and I really wish I could go to work, but we just can't afford it. The childcare would wipe us out. I think it's tragic. And I do see things have improved, but it's still hard out there for women.
It is still hard out there for women. And, you do hear the stories of, well, I'm basically working to pay for childcare, but it's also to keep their foot in the door, that if they don't keep working, and this is where the whole pathways, career pathways, particularly in corporate situations, need to be reassessed and reshaped, so that if a woman chooses to have 2 years, 5 years out of the direct workplace, that perhaps she can do the work from home, which one of the benefits of COVID is that has allowed us that, but also that the skills that a woman develops, and I'm going to just keep using women here because by and large we're still the ones who stay at home to look after the kids, but the skills that women develop that don't come with any paper qualifications, but which are hugely transferable into the workplace, need to be recognised for what they are: the organisational skills, the conflict management skills, the time management skills. So many different things that women take for granted because they just have to do them. And I think just even resilience of dealing with sick children and hardly any sleep, and, the ability to persevere and get up each day. Like all of those skills, they're amazing skills to have in your workforce.
I 100% could not agree with that more. I often say that women are like the CEO of a household. And that's not true always. I do understand there are some men who are literally running their households, raising the kids, doing all the things, all the power to them, but they are still in a minority. And I don't know that that's necessarily because that's what men choose, or it's because men suddenly become, and here's the other thing, it's pay disparity as well. It's a big thing that holds men in the workforce instead of being at home with their kids, because quite often they become the primary, the primary earner, the breadwinner. And so then you kind of go, that's another reason why this kind of disparity happens between who's at home looking after the kids, right? And look, it is possible, as you say, like, a lot of people have both parents working and the kids are in childcare and whatever, and they're just fine, and good luck to them. It's so different for everyone. But I agree. I think that it is so important for women to that's one bit of sage advice. Keep your foot in the door, even if it's 1 day a week, even if it's 1 day a week working from home, because it's really difficult for women, especially as they get older, to return back to the workforce.
Yes, it is indeed. It is. And that was one of the things that
Yeah.
I always worried about, because I was, yes, a trained teacher, but I did a lot of it as a casual teacher, as a young mother with young children. And then I, joined the Salvation Army, and I have a degree in theology, but where will that take me outside of a theological institution? Now I've realised all that I've learned is actually really, really hugely valuable. But I didn't have a career pathway. And so, when you are suddenly, as I was in my early 50s, having to reinvent your life, you go, well, what on earth do I do now?
And you're living proof, and that it's not about your age, that you can actually find a new path, you can find a new career, you can find happiness, that women don't have to stay in relationships that are making them miserable or whatever. But I do think, and on this podcast I get to talk to a lot of them, there are so many women out there who it's in this age bracket. It's
Yes.
generally around the 45, 50, 55 mark, where women suddenly say, oh, you know what? I've always wanted to try A, B, and C, and off they go and do it. Or they find themselves, oh, I've been made redundant in a position. Now what the hell am I going to do? And start to realize this is a golden opportunity rather than a setback for them to actually be able to try something new. Is it scary? Sure. Is it exciting? Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, it's quite amazing to have an opportunity to be able to try something new. And I think, as you say, probably the first time where women have bandwidth, where they have time
Yes.
to think about themselves, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's great. And I am grateful that I have this opportunity now, that I am, reasonably healthy for this stage of my life. I'm looking probably for another 13 years of active working life, because I keep thinking, well, what would I do if I wasn't doing this? I've got grandchildren, but I don't want to be knitting beanies.
Right? And these are funny. I was listening to Jane Fonda, brilliant. She's still working. She's in her 80s, and I love that. And that's what she says. Well, I do it because what else would I be doing if I wasn't doing this? And, because it still brings her joy. It brings her
Yes.
joy. That's the whole thing, right? But, okay, so let's talk about, if women are listening to this, Bron, and it's resonating with them, and they just need a little bit of help to reconnect to themselves, to find their power, to find their purpose. Tell us how they can get in touch with you, and tell us a little bit about what they might expect when they're working with you.
Yeah. Look, I always say to people, stalk me on LinkedIn. So I'm Bron Williams. I'm Bron Williams all over social media. And, I've got the distinctive face, the grey hair and the glasses, so I'm easy to find. My website is bronwilliams.com. So nice and easy. My email is info@bronwilliams.com. Let's keep it nice and simple so we don't have to worry. So particularly remember, it's not AU. I decided to do this as a global website, so that people know that I'm not just, talking to Australian women. What you'll get, I like that question. What will you get when you talk with Bron? Okay, what you'll get is what you see. I'm a what you see is what you get type of girl. I am both honest and diplomatic in that I can tell you the things that I believe need to be said, but I'm always going to do it with care, because I recognise that all of us can listen to hard things if we are taken along the journey with us. I'd say the second thing is, I will allow you to go on whatever sort of journey you want to go on, and I will encourage you to go inward, because heads up, there's no monsters lurking inside. And I think sometimes people think there must be a monster lurking inside, therefore I don't want to do this. No, there's no monsters lurking inside. There are things we don't know about ourselves that if we did know, we could do something about. But there are no monsters, so don't be afraid. So I think that's a really important thing to know. And also that I'm with you, that I've been there, done that. No, I haven't, I haven't had your journey, Sandy, in terms of childhood experiences, but I've done a lot of things in life. So I've got an empathetic heart, and I can listen well, and I've got really good insight.
You certainly do, Bron. You are such a beautiful person. I will say that I met Bron in a female networking group that we are both a part of called She's the Boss. Bron and I had the most incredible conversation on the day that we met, and then we just have had phone calls, and I think you're wonderful. I really love your wisdom. I love your incredible ability to actually see a person for who they are. I think that that's such a gift. And I know, 5 minutes into a conversation with Bron, believe me, you will feel seen and you will feel heard. So that's a beautiful gift, Bron, that you bring to the universe. And as I said, I think we could probably talk for about 12 hours and it would still not be enough. But I am going to put all the links where people can find you, all the links you've just told us about will go in our show notes and across our socials when this podcast comes out.
Beautiful.
I think what you're doing is amazing. I think anybody who works with women with such a beautiful purpose to help other women is definitely part of our sisterhood, and certainly welcome here in the confessional. So I thank you.
Oh, thank you, Sandy. It's been great talking with you, and you've asked me questions that other people haven't necessarily, and I always love that because I get to talk about things in a way that maybe I haven't in the past, and that always just continues to grow me, and so I'm very thankful for that.
Thank you, Bron. And, I love, that's the magic of the confessional, I think. People come in and think, oh, I'm not going to talk about anything. And then they come in and they do.
Yes.
I am so grateful for your time and your energy. I think you're brilliant. I know everyone's going to love this podcast. And as I said, we'll put up links everywhere so people can get in touch with you, Bron. I think you're amazing.
Thank you. It's been lovely.
It has been. Thanks for listening to the Good Girl Confessional podcast. The Good Girl Confessional podcast is brought to you by WB40, Women Beyond 40 magazine. Available now at WB40.com. The Good Girl Confessional podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to quality podcasts. We're also now available on YouTube. We chat with really interesting women about their hard-won wisdom, but it really helps us if you can subscribe, like, and share the podcast. Thanks so much for your support. Bye for now.